those climax communities, stable ecosystems, and first we're going to look at the ones that we find on land. In the next section, the last section, we'll look at a couple of different aquatic biomes, but there are really probably not as many big major stable ecosystems as you might think. We define these as biomes. They are characterized by their climate, and climates are going to help dictate the type of plant and animal life that will live there. There are lots of different ecosystems within a single biome, so we're going to talk about 6 or 7 different major biomes. But within each of those biomes, there are individual ecosystems, and each one of those ecosystems has a little different biotic and abiotic features. But we're looking here at a biome, which is a group of ecosystems sharing similar climates. There, that was a tough word this morning. And primary production characteristics, so plant life. We can start at the equator and either go north or south toward the poles. But in general, when we do that, these are the biomes we would run into. Tropical rainforest, tropical dry forest, savanna, deserts, temperate rainforest, temperate forest, temperate grassland, chaparral, boreal forest, and then tundra. And so there are let's see what we got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9 different biomes, and we'll talk about each one individually. They roughly run from the equator to the poles, or in the other direction. If you start at the pole, we would go tundra, boreal forest, chaparral, all the way down to tropical rainforest in general. And that's because latitude is an important factor in determining climate. Climate is the long-term average weather, whereas weather is day-to-day conditions. And each particular biome has a characteristic climate, and that can be shown in a climatograph, which is a way to graph 3 different things on the same graph. It covers temperature, average temperatures, average rainfall, and so we're not going to get into those in this text, but you may run into that at some point. So climate, again, is the average conditions, which would include temperature, precipitation over a long period of time for a given area, whereas weather is the day-to-day conditions in the Earth's atmosphere. And again, each biome has a set of characteristic organisms that have adapted to these particular climate conditions. So the organisms you find within a biome tend to be well suited for that environment, and that's because they are there because of natural selection and diversity. Specific areas of a large biome will have different species, and that's driven by niche realization. So an organism will be adapted to fill a particular job in a biome. That's driven by competition, of course, and ultimately it's led by or supported by the number and the amount of primary producers in that region. So net primary production refers to how much or how many producers there are, and producers do form the base of the food chains. And it turns out that warm, wet biomes tend to support more production, more producers. Those producers use some of that glucose. Whatever's left over can be used by higher up in the food chain. So let's look at the first. We'll start at the equator. Tropical rainforest has year-round warm temperatures, at least 6.5 feet of precipitation a year. The soil itself is generally nutrient poor, But the forest canopy, the emergent layer, the top part of the forest, has a huge variety of plants, and those plants are going to tend to have large flat leaves and shallow roots. They support more animal species than any other biomes, but the animals that are there tend to be highly specialized and fill a very small niche. From there, we would go to a tropical dry forest, which is a warm year-round. The area is warm year-round, but rainfall is seasonal. The trees we would find here tend to be deciduous. Those are the ones that lose their leaves and cease photosynthesis during part of the year. Plants and animals here have adaptations to help conserve water during the dry seasons. They may have waxy leaf coatings, deep roots. Estivation is kind of like hibernation, except it's not for the winter. And many of them migrate in and out during the rainy seasons. Savanna receives less precipitation than a tropical dry forest, but more than a desert. It usually has a very distinct rainy season. There are grasses here with a few groups of trees around. The trees grow. Tree growth tends to be limited because the grasses favor frequent fires, and the flatness tends to allow for strong winds. So plants are going to be adapted to those dry conditions. They're going to tend to be deciduous trees when they are there. They'll have deep roots with thick bark, and many animals will migrate to find water or burrow when water is scarce. A desert receives less than 9, almost 10 inches of precipitation a year. Their temperatures are going to vary widely, very hot during the day, very cold at night. Plants are going to have thick, leathery leaves. They'll store water within their tissues, and they will have shallow roots. Most animals are going to get their water not from a water source, but from eating. Most animals tend to be nocturnal when it is cooler. Mammals you find in desert regions have exaggerated appendages, ears, arms, or paws and legs. That helps them regulate body temperature. A temperate rainforest is a year-round moderate temperatures with heavy rainfall. They found their largest extent of them is found in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, actually. It's characterized by tall evergreen trees like cedars and hemlocks, and they're evergreens. They don't lose their leaves annually. A lot of those are also conifers, which means they produce cones, and seeds are found in cones like pine cones. Forest floor is shaded, damp, usually covered in moss. Animals that need a lot of moisture, like amphibians, thrive in these types of biomes. The temperate temperate forest, the precipitation is evenly spread throughout the year. We have varied temperatures, tend to be hot summers, cold winters. Plants tend to be broadleafed and deciduous. Soils enriched with nutrients from the annual leaf drop. Animals may migrate, hibernate, or store food to survive the cold conditions of the winter. And the temperate grasslands, similar to that, except this would be what we would typically call a prairie. They have a moderate seasonal precipitation and extreme seasonal temperatures. They are susceptible to both droughts and fires. There is not enough precipitation to support large trees, grasses, so grasses are preferred or better able to adapt and live in these grasslands. The animals will be adapted to deal with the fact that there's very little cover provided. The soils tend to be very rich in nutrients, and most of the world's grasslands have been converted into farmland. The chaparral is a highly seasonal conditions with mild, wet winters and warm, dry summers. There are prolonged hot, dry periods. Droughts and fires are also common in the chaparral. Chaparral is going to be very similar to the savanna. Plants are going to be drought resistant, have thick, waxy leaves and leaves with hairs to trap moisture. Plants are going to have thick bark, deep roots to help resist fire. But there are many plants that require fire in order for their seeds to become activated and be able to germinate. Many animals are going to burrow or be nocturnal to avoid the heat. A boreal forest is a long, cold winter, short, cool summers. The soil in a boreal forest or a taiga tends to be nutrient poor, slightly acidic. There's a low species diversity. We don't have a lot of different species in a boreal forest. We have coniferous trees that have waxy needles and conical shape. That helps adapt them to snowy conditions. The animals are going to generally feed, breed, and care for the young during the short warm season. And if there are year-round residents or those year-round residents, they will have thick insulation and small extremities and helps conserve heat. Further north, we have the tundra, which is extremely cold, dark winters, relatively sunny and cool summers, found only in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere. Harsh winds, nutrient-poor soil, freezing temperatures are going to limit plant growth. There are no tall trees. Mosses and lichens are common in tundra. The tundra is characterized by something called permafrost, and that is a layer of soil underground that is frozen all year long, even in the heat of the summer. Birds and caribou migrate to the tundra during the mild summers to help to feed on insects and lichens. There are not many organisms that live in the tundra year-round. So we also have polar ice and mountains. We'll look at mountains because although these are not classified as individual biomes, the mountain, because of its altitude, sets up a very similar situation to what we have on the planet with latitude. So you can go from the base of a mountain, which may be in a desert, and then the next elevation, as elevation goes up, the next kind of ecosystem you would run into would be a grassland, and that would lead to a chaparral-like structure ecosystem, to temperate forest, boreal forest, until you reach the high altitudes above the tree line, and then you would be in a similar situation to tundra. So they're not exactly the same, but the elevation of mountains tends to lead to the same kind of striation of not biomes, but regions, ecosystems that look similar to biomes. All right, I'm going to stop it there. I'll put the assignments up. Keep up the good work.